So this evening I'm going to talk about this Dharma I have reached, and try to interweave that into some of the things I mentioned last night. But just to remind myself and to just kind of get it out here, just kind of the way that I'm thinking about this in these four aspects is, again, trying to offer a talk that has metaphor and analogy, story, these kinds of ideas to really, again, to try to get at the emotional undertone of the teachings. And also try to follow the logic and the structure of Dharma as a theory to try to encapsulate the pragmatic nature of the work that we're trying to do here. And really the just very doableness of this. This is not mystical or esoteric at all. And again, to provide some personal stories and some experiences that I can point to, that I can explain, that can really get to the humanness and the kind of transparent nature of this has been a very real process that I find myself still in. And also, again, for y'all to try to offer a kind of contemplative frame so you can kind of apply this stuff towards and reflect upon your experience with this. Because this is the thing about the Dharma, I think that's very clear, that I just want to name, is the Buddha is talking about a universal experience, but we have our subjective version of that experience. Right? So the universal, in Buddhism, have Dharma practice, Dharma teachers in general, have really, I think, overemphasized the importance of the universe, the universality of the experience, and sometimes leave aside the content or the personal stuff in a way which sometimes it can come across as that it sort of doesn't matter. And it certainly matters. One thing I want to say before I forget about this wound that seeks the arrow, and that really what that is, that's an aspect of dukkha sankhara, that's an aspect of the chitta, mind arising and passing away. But also it's very clear in the early discourses that this process that I'm speaking of is not inherent. It's not built into the DNA structure of the chitta. It's very much constructed through experience. I think that's very important. And I think this also goes against what we usually think about in terms of brain science and trauma therapy and kind of the way that we think the mind is just kind of designed for this kind of crappy behavior. It's not. That the chitta, the mind, the experience is inherently luminous, expansive, open, adaptable, malleable, but something happens along the way that we kind of lose sight of that, don't we? Right. So these things are constructed. They're learned, they're conditioned, they're not, I hope that makes sense, they're not an inherent quality of the mind process. They're not built into the mechanics. So to be liberated from that actually is totally doable, and actually to some degree instantaneous, getting insight into that. I want to speak to one sutta that's called the Ocean. You've probably heard it's a very short sutta, and it starts off with the Buddha talks about the process of Dharma, of awakening, is like walking into the ocean. And it's not, you don't just step in and go straight down. There's no steep precipice. There's a gradual deepening, kind of going deeper, that this process that we're in is slow and gradual. And some of us talked about this earlier today, that you're not at the beginning of you're not at the beginning of the race. Most of you, many of you are really halfway around the track. And a lot of times, as I said last night, I think a lot of times that the wound doesn't know all of the progress that we've made. And we stay stuck in these old paradigms, these old stories, these archetypal patterns. And so, even though the pattern is old, if I see it again today, it doesn't feel old. It feels very right now, because it has a patterning that goes backwards. And you've probably heard this many times, but he says, just as the ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, the Dharma has but one taste, the taste of freedom, or the taste of liberation. And I like this word freedom more. I think it's a good word. I think we know this word. Liberation sometimes sounds a little bit too undoable. I'm not going to be liberated. I mean, that's ridiculous. But this idea of trying to be free. And I think that we have to really acknowledge that there's really two sides of the coin of freedom. And that mostly we, because of our culture and living in America, and we live in a free country and we can do what we want and all that kind of conditioning we have, we think that freedom is about being free to do something. But Dharma freedom that we're cultivating here, that we're opening to, that we're practicing is very different. It's a freedom from. Right? Sometimes the Buddha makes the analogy of kind of being let out of prison. Right? And so that's a very different kind of freedom. So we can see, and I'm sure you've seen already many times, there's qualities and there's things inside my experience that I would like to be free from. And that's the freedom that we're looking for. I'm not trying to be free to do as much as I'm trying to be free from. Right? And so that means I need to understand, and I need to look, and I need to be clear, and I need to embrace, and I need to turn towards, and I need to fully actually understand what it is that I need to be free from, or I'll never be free from it. And that oftentimes entails looking at things, acknowledging things, feeling things that we just don't really want to address. So that's what makes it so hard. One thing I forgot to mention last night that was very important, I can't remember everything sometimes, that there was another, I would say, a Nibbanic event, a kind of Nibbanic latency in my teen years that really was as profound as any of the other ones, and that was when I had moved to Western Massachusetts. I was a senior in high school, and until I was a senior in high school, I never cared at all about school or writing or reading. I wasn't interested in any of it. I didn't learn anything in my first 11 years of school. I don't think so. I don't remember any of it. I was either dissociated or high, or both. And I had a teacher named Peter Stradinsky, who was a really great teacher. In fact, I ran into him when I was in Massachusetts a couple years ago. Me, Shannon, Emmett, and Coyote were walking down the street in Northampton, and he just arose. And I told him all the things that he had said. He totally couldn't believe that I was doing what I was doing. He totally couldn't believe the things that he had taught me. And one of the things he taught a lot about Joseph Campbell, about the hero's journey. He also had us read two books. I had to read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse and The Stranger by Albert Camus. And I don't know why, but I fucking read them both. I don't know what he did to me, but I actually read them, and they were very transformative, actually. And I think what really helped me, and it still helps me to this day, and I'm still very interested in existential philosophy. I think existential philosophy and the Dharma very much go hand in hand. And reading those in tandem at that time in my life was very, very transformative, and really kind of getting a sense of this path. There were in the pages of those books, and The Stranger is kind of a dark book if you haven't read it. Albert Camus was a very brilliant thinker. I think he was the most intelligent and advanced thinkers of the entire existential movement. And one of his very premises was freedom and responsibility, which is a very Buddhist idea. Yeah, you're free to do whatever you want, actually. I mean, I could pick up that chair and throw it through that window right now. I could. I'm not going to, but I could do that. But then I would have to be responsible for what would arise out of that. And so that was a very, I think, a very concrete way to talk about something like karma. And every time I do something, there's consequences. And if I don't do something, there's consequences. And that was very, very, that really opened my mind actually to the idea of learning. That actually maybe reading books was not such a bad idea. So that was really the first time, I think really, he opened my mind to a kind of philosophical endeavor, which really helped me with a lot of my ways of seeing the world. It really opened me the fact that I was kind of choosing to see things the way that I was seeing things, that actually there was choice. Right? And I was free to think whatever I wanted, but I could. But the thing that really got me with freedom and responsibility was I was free to let my mind do whatever it was doing, but I was responsible for how it felt, and that really woke me up. I'm like, oh my God, like I'm actually creating the bad feelings that I'm having. But that was about as far as I got. I didn't really figure out what to do from there. And so I want to talk about these. Some of you have probably heard me talk about this before, but I want to talk about the Dharma in terms of the way that the Buddha describes it. And it comes from a text called The Noble Quest. It's Majjhima Nikaya 26. And it's one of the few, probably one of the first suttas that I ever read or studied that kind of made the hair on the back of my neck stand up a little bit. It kind of chilled me a little bit. Right? And so the story of it is also understood by academics to be one of the oldest discourses, one of the oldest stories in the canon, which I tend to put more weight on those. And it's the only time really where he talks about, in a very specific way, what is this Dharma that I have reached? And the story goes, he is early on, it's right when, soon after King Pasenadi gave him Jeta's Grove. Now, Jeta's Grove was really an area where the Buddha probably spent most of his life. It was in the inner city. King Pasenadi had given it to him. It's where most of the monks live. It was very rich. It was very lush. It was really kind of a gift given to the Buddha and his followers by King Pasenadi, who actually was a total tyrant. King Pasenadi was like the Donald Trump of the day. I guess I can probably say that in here. Not a good dude at all. But with somebody that the Buddha kind of did business with all the time. They had a very, very relationship, a strong relationship, meeting with each other all the time, really throughout the whole Buddha's teaching career. And so he's there, and Ananda comes over and says there's these monks a couple areas over who have been practicing, and they really want to hear a teaching, and it would be great for us to go over there and talk to them. And so the Buddha prepares the journey, and they go over there, and the Buddha goes into the hall where they're all sitting, and they're having a Dharma discussion. They're just kind of talking about practice and talking about the Dharma. Of course, they've yet to meet Siddhartha Gautama at this point. It's the first time he comes in. And he comes over to sit down, and they kind of bow 3 times as they usually do. And they ask him, they say, we've been talking about practice, we've been talking about the Dharma, we're kind of excited and doing all this stuff, and we're so grateful that you're here. And they ask him, and it's kind of the only time, the Buddha gets asked questions all the time. Mostly the questions that he gets asked are people who are kind of trying to irritate him. So there's all these humorous tales in the canon about people coming and go, well, you said this, and what do you mean by this, and what do you mean about that? And they ask him, they say, what is this Dharma that you've reached, actually? What is this? And he says this. He says, this Dhamma I have reached is deep, hard to see, difficult to awaken to, quiet and excellent, not confined or reached by thought, subtle, incensed by the wise, or actually felt by the wise. Felt, sensed, meaning this from the root Vedana, to feel. He's saying it's not something that you come to by logic, by reason, by thinking about. It's something that you come to understand through a felt sense of experience. And it's hard to see. Now this is an interesting phrase. I always thought when he said it was hard to see, that he meant like you had to have like really good Vipassana chops. Like you had to get really, really concentrated and really, really, you know what I mean? And then like you would see it. I always thought, and I was chased to seeing of the Dharma, which was totally fruitless. But he means hard to see. Actually, the Pali word is dudasi, which means do as in the prefix of dukkha. So he doesn't actually say that the Dharma is hard to see as much as he says it's painful to see, which is very interesting. Right? It's very hard to see and painful to see are kind of different, right? And we see this, right? We see, and this is why there's so much, I think, emphasis that I place on this embracing of dukkha, because this is really, actually what he's saying in the sentence is he's actually formulating the idea for the first truth, I believe. He's saying, this is really hard, man. But he also says it's quiet and it's excellent. So there's a kind of way in which it's hard to see, but actually you want to see it. You want to know. You want to understand this experience. Right? He goes on to say, but people love their place. They delight and revel in their place. It is hard for people who delight, revel in their place to see this ground, this conditionality, conditioned arising. So when he says to see this ground, actually what he's talking about, and we'll talk about this on Sunday, the ground is paticca samuppada, which is dependent arising. That's the ground. And the ground is tana, the same word as satipatthana. So now there's a mindfulness aspect to it. He's trying to get us to see a ground rather than being preoccupied with a place or a destination or a kind of status or being a person who has a role in the world. So there's a shift that we're trying to make from place to ground. Right? And the thing that's so hard about being on retreat is as soon as we get close to seeing the ground and we start to see its difficult nature, we start to see the painful aspects of it, what we do is we imagine another place to be in that would be better than this ground. And then we're gone. Right? And we delight in that, we revel in the place. And a place could be being a person, it can be a self, atta. It can be our role in society. It can be our status. And the problem with place also is place is very finite. It's very locked. It's very fixed. Right? Have you had moments since you've been here where you felt like you were sort of like in a place and you're like, I don't really like this place. It's going to be like this forever. My back is going to hurt the whole fucking retreat. I know it. And there we are, locked into that place. And we even sometimes delight and revel in places that are actually very unsatisfying. So now he's talking actually about the second truth, or the second task. He's saying we go somewhere else, we become preoccupied, we cling, we crave, we grasp, and we fuel another experience that we could be having rather than the one that we are having, and we don't actually see the ground, the satipatthana. Remember to recognize the ground. So we have 1 and 2 right there. It took me a long time to sort this out. But he's really saying this is kind of what we're seeing. And then he goes on. He says, also hard to see this ground, the stilling of all inclinations, which is the term for sankhara, the stilling of all sankharas, the relinquishing of bases, I'm not sure what that means, the fading away of craving, I know what that means. Stopping nibbana, third noble truth. Right? So he's teasing us out. He said, this is what I reach, this is what I've seen, this is the Dharma that I've seen. Now when he explains the Dharma, he also, when he talks about nibbana, which I'll talk about tomorrow morning, he talks about them in the same way. He uses the same language. So in many ways, Dhamma and Nibbana are synonyms. There's also other terms. Equanimity would be a term that would be adjacent to Nibbana, Dhamma. The deathless, which is my favorite one. I don't know what that means, but it sounds so cool. I want the deathless. Right? Unconditioned, the unconditioned, that which is unconditioned by greed, hatred, and confusion. All these things are kind of talking to the same place. And he doesn't go into the fourth truth here, he ends there. But then he goes on to say, were I to teach the Dhamma and others would not understand me, that would be tiring and vexing for me. Why should I now reveal what I have reached with so much difficulty? This Dhamma is not easily awoken to by those enthralled with craving and hatred. Those died by desire, covered by a mass of darkness, will not see what goes against the stream. And that's where that term comes from. Patisa Tagami. Subtle, deep, hard to see and find. On thinking this over, monks, my mind inclined to inaction, my mind inclined to not teaching the Dharma. So early on, it almost sounds as if he's having a kind of conversation in his own mind, like he's actually kind of struggling. And then the text goes on to say that he kind of looks at the world, he surveys the world, and he kind of sees how people are, and he sees his culture, and he sees how people behave, and he kind of says, yeah, this is not going to go down. Nobody is going to want to do this. Right? And then there's other story. I'll tell you the story. I don't know how much I believe, but the story is that this Brahmin, this kind of religious deity figure, kind of comes down from the heavens or whatever. Which this is where I start to go, okay. But I think it's an analogy and it's a metaphor. I don't think it actually really happened. And they said to him, no, what you have woken to, what you have found is profound and meaningful, and people need it. And this is where that phrase comes, those with a little dust in their eyes. They said there's people who have a little bit of dust in their eyes who will actually get it. There won't be a lot of them, there'll be a couple, there'll be 13 who will get it, and they'll be happy, and they'll respect it, and they'll follow it, and they'll cultivate it, and it'll be worth it for you. And then it says out of anukampa, which is the actual, probably the most accurate, certainly the one that appears most in the Pali Canon, the term for compassion. Anukampa. That's that word I spoke of, that when we talk about, and some teachers talk about it, and it's correct, but they use it in the wrong context, the quivering of the heart in response to somebody else's pain. It really actually means the crying out of another. And the crying out of another, the Buddha awakening to his own woundedness. The Buddha did not have an easy go of it. Let's be clear about that. He was probably traumatized. And out of that, he said, you know what? Out of compassion for the world, I will now teach this Dharma that I have reached. And then he made this decision to go forth. Now, if you follow it chronologically, we all know the turning of the wheel of Dhamma, the Four Noble Truths, is understood as the first discourse, but that's probably historically pretty inaccurate. He probably was teaching and doing lots of other things. In fact, the teachings of the Four Noble Truths probably came more like in the middle of his teaching career. Right? But we know it's kind of known and taught as being his first teaching. But there's really no historical evidence to back that up. But you can see these ideas get formulated here, can't you? You can see these kind of ideas become formulated. And then there's another sutta I want to flag here because I think this is also very interesting. It's called Clearly Visible But Hard to See. It's like, well, which one is it? Is it clearly visible or hard to see? And he defines the Dharma in this way. He also defines Nibbana in this way. He says, the Dharma is clearly visible but hard to see. It's immediate, inviting, effective, and again, sensed by the wise, felt by those who are so bold to dare to look. Right, so you see that terminology again. Right, so again, it's immediate. And I think this immediate idea is very, very important because when we look at the structure of these truths, it's not this lineal grind, it's almost this moment-to-moment experience. There's this dukkha, there's this pain, there's maybe this woundedness we know about, and then we see the arrow arising, we see this kind of reactivity. But that goes away. And then Nibbana is not like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Right? It's just like the Dharma. It's always here. It's always visible. It's inviting. It's uplifting. Right? And it's like we tap into this aspect of the mind stream that is cool. So we look at the analogy of he talks a lot of times of heat and fire. Heat, fire, coolness. Those are the earliest ideas we see in analogy that he uses. And of course, they're great because they're so easy. Fire and coolness are so easy to understand. Right? And he talks about, sometimes they're called the three poisons, but that comes much later. There are these three fires, these rise up. Right? And that's kind of that delight and that reveling in that place and that construction of a better experience to be in. And then you're gone. And that doesn't go on that goes on, a couple minutes at most. But when that passes away, when that ceases, when the term is nirodha, we don't usually see it. Right? Have you been really, really upset? And then, of course, you don't stay upset. But do you track the moments when the upsetness kind of passes away? I don't. I mean, I do now. Someone finally pointed it out to me that was a good idea. But we don't, when we look at, arising and falling away, so these are the big kind of terms that we see, that we see that there is dukkha, this is dukkha, a craving, reactivity arises, it also ceases. So just like what goes up must come down. But we don't usually see the passing away of experience, of phenomena. The breath is actually a really interesting way to observe this phenomenon. Like, I don't know about you, but when I do mindfulness of breathing, at least historically, I noticed that I would give the in-breath quite a lot of attention, and my mind would wander on the out-breath. And I would give the in-breath quite a lot of attention, and my mind would wander on the out-breath. Right? And so when we look at the way that the body is, the physiology of the body is that when we breathe in, there's kind of contraction, which is why concentration was always so troubling for me. And the way the nervous system is designed, and whether the Buddha knew this or not, I don't know, but it certainly lines up. So when we breathe in, we engage the sympathetic nervous system, which is the gas pedal, which is the activator. Right? So when we breathe in, we're in our sympathetic nervous system, we breathe out, we're in our parasympathetic nervous system. The out breath, the passing away, is the cooling down, is the brake pedal, is the nibbanic experience. Maybe that's why there's so much emphasis on mindfulness of breathing, and in particular the Anapanasati Sutta, which is a 16 tetrad structured practice of mindfulness of breathing. Maybe I ought to take another look at this mindfulness of breathing thing after all. Right? And so when he talks about breathing out, and then this passing away, this letting go, this nibbana, also the Brahma Viharas are meant to be, so there's an expansion. The out-breath expands outward, and there's a kind of cooling down. But for some reason, I've had to work pretty hard. I've had to kind of train myself to watch the out-breath. Actually, now when I do mindfulness of breathing, which I usually do at least one day a week, I try to just do mindfulness of out-breathing. And actually, when I first started to do that, it was really hard for me to ignore the in-breath, because I had trained myself to vigilantly clock it. So what Ajahn Sachito calls grabbing and dropping. It's like you grab at the in-breath and you just drop the out-breath. Grab it, drop it. This is so boring. Right? Not tuned into the experience at all in any way, shape, or form. So then I spent all these years, in the way that we organize stories. I think the way that we organize our stories are really, really inaccurate, because it's like, like in the way that I sequence my story. I was talking to my Gestalt therapist about this earlier today. It's like, it was really, really bad, and it kind of got a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. Like, I just have this kind of setup and structure that's actually not true. There was actually lots of nibbana, and there was lots of coolness, and there was lots of dharma sprinkled in it all the way along. But that's not the story that I tell, but that's the story that's true. Right? And so after the accident that I went through, after my girlfriend was killed, and after I started practicing, and after the whole Albert Camus thing, I became very I became self-centered, in the sense of I actually didn't really believe a lot of the teachings that I was being heard, that I was being told at IMS, and some of the stuff that didn't make sense to me. When they would say that craving caused suffering, I didn't really get that one. I was like, I'm suffering, but it's not from craving. In fact, my addiction inclination would tell me that actually not satisfying the craving was suffering. It's like, these guys got it wrong. So I kind of went into this whole hedonic thing of like, I'm just going to do what I want to do and just do what feels good. You know? And this was my ultimate delighting and reveling in the place. And I made this kind of deal with the universe. I was like, I'm going to play in a band, and I'm going to get famous, and I'm going to do that whole rock star famous thing, and that's how the universe is going to pay me back for all the horrible shit. Now, I didn't have it that well worked out, like I just said it, but that was basically what was going on. I was like, well, you did this, and I forgive you, but I want this now. And so I really kind of, and I got lucky. I just kind of fell into these bands. There's one particular band that I was in for 10 years. I was 17 years old, playing at bars, playing at college parties. I was really actually having the greatest, fabulous time. I always tell myself, the 90s were fucking so good. Emmett always says that to me. He goes, were the 90s the best? I'm like, yeah, they were kind of the best. He's like, I wish I grew up in the 90s. I was like, you totally wish you grew up in the 90s. But they were good, weren't they? Did everybody have a good time in the 90s? I did. Damn. Best music, best movies, everything good came out of the 90s. And I crushed it in the 90s. Which I know I wasn't allowed to really say at the AA meetings, because I'd be like, mostly my whole career of drinking and using and playing music, 90% of it was totally fabulous, actually. Right? But I would go and I was in bands and I would tour and I would sell drugs and I would do drugs, and I kind of just had this very anarchistic punk rock. I'm not going to participate in the world. I'm sort of better than that. I'm going to do this alternative thing. Very kind of Joe Strummer, fight the system, very anarchist kind of attitude that I had, and it really worked for me, actually. And I felt good about it. It felt really kind of in line with something. It wasn't quite there, but I would go to IMS every summer. Not every summer, but most every summer for 10 days. And it was really kind of, I wouldn't say that it was painful. It wasn't painful. It was very, very odd and very confusing. Because I would kind of use it like a detox a little bit, actually. I would go to IMS for 10 days, and I would have a fabulous Dharma experience. I really would. I would feel totally connected to the teachings. I would have fantasies about doing this. I'd be like, I'm going to be a Dharma teacher someday. And it's like all this kind of stuff. And it felt really true and it felt really good. And as soon as I got back in the car and as soon as I was back to Boston, I was in the bar running my mouth. So I would call it Barstool Buddhist. I would be telling people in the bar about my retreat, and they'd be like, not interested. But I was loud enough that I would think, you will be interested in what I'm saying. Right? You're probably familiar with some of this. And I'll tell you, one of the big Dharma experiences I had, actually, was the most probably bewildering experience. I wrote a story about it at one point. I wish I could find it. But I was succeeding. Like, the band did good. We ended up getting a record deal. We ended up doing all the stuff that you want to do. And I remember when we finally went to Europe to play, we played on these outdoor festivals in Europe, Pickle Pop and Lowlands, 25,000 people. And I remember having the perfect amount of hash and cannabis and beer and alcohol in my system. If anybody who ever explored that world knows when you get the right combo. And I have this 2 Marshall stacks behind me and 25,000 people outside. And I was like, this fucking sucks. Oh man, that was the worst. That was the absolute worst, because I had delighted and reveled and worked and tried so hard. I wanted it so bad. And when I finally got it, I remember standing there and I remember fighting. I remember having, it was like Mara versus Buddha in my mind. I was like, no, this is really great. This is totally great. And it just kind of went back and forth and went back and forth. And at that point, my substance abuse was really not working out so well. It was getting to be, I was starting to have medical problems, and I was 27. Right? And it was one of the most Dharma experiences now when I look back at it now, but at the time, talk about hard to see. Talk about difficult to awaken to. It was not quiet and it was not excellent, I can certainly tell you that. But it was, I knew it was so true in my bones. I was like, I can't do this anymore. I was like, I can't believe I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. I hated myself. I hated everybody in my band. It just didn't work. It was a good arrow, but it did not work. And so then I had to spend the next couple of years really in this kind of faking it mode. Because I didn't know how to get out. I couldn't, I was like, there's no way. I was like, I can't get out because this is like, what am I going to do now? And no one does this. Who quits it? Who does this? Right? And of course, unfortunately for me, I had to pour as much salt and vodka into the wound as I could. It took maybe 2 or 3 years. I won't get into the details, but I was living in Amsterdam and I was really, really bottom feeding on the culture over there in a big way. And then it just hit me one night. It's like a lightning bolt. I think the Dharma has the same lightning bolt quality as trauma does, actually. It just can hit you, and I was like, dude, just quit. Just quit, just stop. It's over. And I remember having this massive osmosis of just this burden of weight, and I was probably wasted out of my mind when I did it. But I remember waking up the next day and it stuck. I was like, yeah, man. I had 2 weeks. I had 2 more weeks in Holland. I had to fake it, and I had to go and I had to pretend, and it was so painful. Which is one thing I appreciate about it, because I had to be so inauthentic for so long that after that the idea of having a morsel of inauthenticity, I just have no stomach for it. I just can't do it. Right? And I got back and I literally quit the band, and then I quit drinking that night. And then it was very odd. I mentioned my friend Chandra last night, Stephen Smith's daughter. I was in Boston and I had just quit my band. I woke up the next morning. I remember the last half-warm Bud Light I drank. I remember I drank about half of it, and I went over and put it on my friend's TV, and I was like, you know what? I'm fucking done with that too. And the next morning, Chandra happened to be in Massachusetts, and she was driving from Cambridge to Western Massachusetts, where I'm from. I was going to move in with Mom and Dad because that's what you do, And she was going to see Tsoknyi Rinpoche, not Tsoknyi Rinpoche, one of those guys. And I drove back with her and her mom, and I got to the Northampton Center for Arts, and Michelle McDonald was there, and Joseph Goldstein was there, and everybody was there at this, they were coming to see this Tibetan Lama guy. It's really weird. I just thought I was catching a ride home. Right? And so it was just so for me it was again, it was a super, so when the Buddha says it's immediate, I know what that means. So these experiences, I read about these in these texts, and I'm like, I had that. These profound experiences. And then I had 60 days sober. I kind of went to AA a little bit. I really didn't want to have to do that. I went and sat with 60 days sober, 2003, the fall of 2003, I went and sat the 3-month retreat at IMS. And for anybody who's in the room who's sober, I know there's a few of you, I don't know if you remember where you were at on day 60, but can you imagine walking into IMS to set a 3-month retreat? Right. But I'd done it enough of times. To me, the sitting of the retreats was no big deal. That still didn't do it for me. And I think a lot of it's to just go back to this kind of, we talked about this in our group, one of the features of the betrayal wound that makes it so difficult to navigate is that with these kinds of wounds, just pain. We talk about pain, right? Just that pain installation. But then when we get these big pain events, we develop a fear of that kind of pain. We're like, that was so bad. I really want to make sure that doesn't happen again, which you, of course, cannot guarantee. So that becomes the beginning of a kind of arrow shooting. That's where hypervigilance comes from. I'm going to clock reality so hard that nothing bad will ever happen on my watch again. That's exhausting. But the fear of the pain, the big one in betrayal one, is the fear of actually being tricked. And one of the reasons why I'm so, what's the word? I guess obsessed is the word, on this kind of early Buddhism and these kind of really getting into the nuts and bolts of these teachings, is I think on all those years and those retreats, and no fault of their own, and I don't blame anybody for this, but I would hear things in Dharma talks and I would hear things in the teachings that didn't make sense to me or I couldn't get behind. And I would have this very conflicted feeling of like, the Dharma feels so true to me. It feels so like what I need and what I want to have. But what there's, it's not really, I'm not so sure about this. I feel like maybe I'm being tricked into doing something that seems very difficult anyway, first of all. Like, let's be honest, this is hard work. So for me, I really have to be bought in. I have to have some kind of buy-in on a very, very fundamental level. I have to have some degree of trust or confidence and faith that what's being offered is very transparent. Very transparent, very doable, very not mystical, very not religious, not otherworldly. Give me a set of, my dad used to do this when I was a kid so I could learn how to use tools. He'd get old motors from the junkyard. And I'd get a set of sockets and wrenches and I'd just go take them apart. That's what I need. I need like the thing that goes on the thing, you turn the thing, you take it off, you put it back on. Mechanics are so important to me, and if I don't understand the mechanics of how this could possibly work, I kind of don't want to do it. And you probably know what I mean. This stuff can get really wonky really, really quickly, and I think sometimes the delivery of what we're doing here also can get very kind of, huh? Right? And so I actually, after that 3-month retreat, was very kind of disenchanted with all of this. I really thought the Dharma was just for white, not that I'm not white, but white educated people who were smart and well-adjusted, and that definitely was not me. I just was like, I just think this is just way too up here, and I'm just way too down here, right? And then I got home, and then the year after that, I went and sat, the Forest Refuge had just opened, and I went and sat there in February. It was like The Shining. I don't know if you've been to the Forest Refuge, but it's kind of like The Shining anyway. It's like way up in the woods on this hill in the New England Institute. And it was me, there was 2 other people there. It was like 4 feet of snow on the ground. It was like 0 degrees. They were like, don't go outside. It's too cold. Like they wouldn't even they were like, you can't go out. So I'm just in the Forest Refuge, like at this point, like a year sober. There's like 2 other people. So I'm not like, this is obviously not the place to be. And this teacher who was probably fine, but at the time I could not stand. I don't remember what her name is, I wouldn't say it anyway. But she actually would have her Dharma talks, she would print them and she would read them. The whole thing. And I was just like, couldn't take it, man. And I was so mad, and I really felt like I was being tricked. And I really felt like I was even tricking myself. I'm like, what are you doing, dude? Just go back to AA, like get it together. Like this is not for you, dude. Totally not for you. And I left early. I left after 10 days and I went home. And I didn't meditate or practice or read a Dharma book or sit for 5 years after that. I was out. Totally out. And I was in recovery, and it was actually, in a way, it was kind of good that I was out, actually. I think there wasn't a whole lot there for me. At least it didn't seem to be that way at the time. And I was doing this other thing. And so this is really, for me, like the first 5 years of sobriety. I really credit being in recovery, and I really credit Alcoholics Anonymous for giving me sila. Stop lying, dude. Like pay your taxes. Like pay your cell phone bill like before they turn off the service. Like, it really helped me kind of get acclimated and to just kind of like trying to just be a member of society. It really humbled me. It was really, really quite good for me to do that. I still had a sense of it, but it was kind of very, very distant. And because of that, I always tell people, don't ever leave retreat early. You might never come back. Right? And if anybody ever almost left retreat early before, right? You've had those moments, right? It's really destructive, I think. It is a very, very confusing and shameful ride home. Like if I ever felt like a true failure, it was that truck ride home from this being like, I'd been sitting retreats at that point for almost 20 years. So where to go from here so I can fit all this in? The time goes by so fast. The one thing I'll say is that the Dharma door that really worked for me actually after that period of time was actually my last real significant teacher was Noah Levine. Many of you know him and we're part of that community. Actually, one of the things I really credit him for and I'm really grateful for is he actually took it down to the ground. He took it off of the pedestal, off of that kind of, this is not for you, and really kind of brought it back down to the ground for me. And I started, after living in Nashville, Tennessee for a while, I really became on fire for Dharma. After my first divorce in Nashville, Tennessee, I was working in treatment centers, and I was kind of teaching mindfulness a little bit. And I kind of, and that, ironically, marriage ended in a massive betrayal. Can you imagine that I would have been attracted to somebody? My wife, we'd gotten married and we were in AA, and she kind of like started drinking again and doing all kinds of stuff like that. And we were in Nashville for 2 weeks, and the whole thing was over. But I started sitting again. It just hit me. I was like, I need to get back to my practice. I need to get back to this stuff. And I was working with teenagers and teaching meditation. And I really I don't know what happened. I got that immediate. I got lit up for the Dharma like I had never actually had been in a long time. And it was like a 5-year break. And it was like, it was right back. I was right back there. And that's one thing I think is important to emphasize, is it's actually never that far away. It's not 5 miles into the woods, 5 miles back. Ajahn Suchita, who I sat with quite a bit, who delivers this stuff so well, this Dharma Nibbana thing, he's always just like, it's right under your nose. It's like right here all of the time. It's immediate. It's uplifting. It's inviting. Right? It's never far away. It's always around. It's in the next moment. It's in this very moment all the time. Right? Nibbana doesn't come and go. Dharma doesn't come and go. We do. We depart. We get caught, and it's so hard in the world that we live in now. It's so hard to not delight and to revel in your place, and to not want to do this kind of thing, and to not want to be in this experience. And then the thing that really I think lit me on fire, that really has actually kind of continued up until this moment right now, was I went and I had read Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist, one of Stephen Batchelor's early. Actually, I don't even know if it's one of his early books. It's probably more like his middle book. And one thing I liked about that book is he has a chapter in that book called A Buddhist Failure. It's a very sad book. I don't know if you've read it before. To me, the tone of the book is very sad. Where he's just like, I tried to be a Buddhist and I totally failed. I tried to be a Tibetan Buddhist monk and I had to leave there because I failed, because I couldn't buy into the core logic. And then I went to the Zen monastery for 7 years, like he wasn't like kicking tires, like he was trying. He learned Tibetan language and like translated the texts, right? And I remember reading that chapter called A Buddhist Failure, and I really resonated with it. And I was like, yeah, I'm a Buddhist failure, and it feels so good. I'm so glad I failed at Buddhism, right? Because it was just way too much. I was asking too much. It seems too unbelievable. And then I noticed that he was teaching at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, him and Martine. It was really, really early on. It was right after he had I think he came out of the closet with these Four Noble Truths around maybe like 2007. if you look, there's a retreat he did at Spirit Rock, I think around '07, and there's a series of talks that I've listened to 1,000 times, starting with who Gautama was, the Four Noble Truths, his awakening. There's like 5 talks. They were the first talks he gave. Interestingly enough, he has yet to be invited back to Spirit Rock since. Him and I have had conversations about this, right? And it was really, really lit me up, because I was like, oh, this is actually, what he's saying is really making sense to me. This is really, what he's saying is really lining up with how I've experienced this stuff. And I remember trying to register for the course at Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, and it was totally full with a waiting list. And they called me like the day before, and I was in Nashville, Tennessee at the time. They called me the day before the retreat started and said, hey, a spot opened up, can you make it? And I said yes, and I hung up the phone, and I got in my car and drove to Massachusetts. Right? And it was so funny, because, if you listen to him, he kind of sounds like a neurotic intellectual a little bit. But you guys who saw him on the screen, he's actually quite personable. And I remember I was in the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. I was looking through the books, and I saw at the corner of my arm Martine Batchelor out in the yard. And she saw me, and she came. She is awesome, by the way. She came like racing in, like as if I was the most important person in the world. And she like pokes me in my arm like pretty hard and goes, who are you? Like she has this kind of like French, almost Korean accent. And I was like, she was so like, she was like, I want to know everything about you right now. And I told her who I was, and she's like, oh, you got on at the last minute. She said, come over, you need to meet Stephen right now. And like we walk over to like the house where he's staying, and he's like sleeping. She like goes in and wakes him up. She's like, Stephen, Dave Smith is here. You have the kid. Like he comes out, he's like, I'm like totally like, oh my God, I just fucking woke this guy up. I'm like, Martine, like, you can't do this. And he's like, no, I've been sleeping for a while. And he really went through a lot of this stuff, and we spent a couple of days on it. And really ever since then, it was like, I finally felt like somebody was offering me a core logic, a kind of like, no, there's this whole other thing going on, right? And I think that when the Dharma can kind of feel like it's alive, like I sometimes think like the Dharma can feel like it's this kind of dead thing that people used to do, right? And it doesn't really, it's hard for you sometimes to read through this stuff, and some of these ideas don't make sense, and you kind of feel frustrated, and I think you have to fight for it. One thing he told me at that retreat that was really helpful is I was starting to teach a little bit, and I had just started Against the Stream teacher training, so I was just starting to go into this. And I said, most of the stuff I read doesn't make sense. I'm like, where should I go? I don't really know where to go. And he said, you should learn to follow your own nose, which I thought was a very interesting thing to say. And I did that. He said, just follow whatever's interesting, just kind of, he said, you really have to do that. You have to follow your own nose. You have to really kind of leave your own self a trail of breadcrumbs. Right. And so there's been this kind of seeing that sometimes we call it secular Dharma, that's a little bit more specific or maybe academic, but even Gil Fronsdale now, who is very well respected. I really respect Gil Fronsdale. Him and even Andrew Olinsky are using this terminology, naturalistic Dharma. And they're really trying to bring these teachings to kind of the natural world, and that this is really something that's alive, that's something that we can participate in, that's part of the human experience. It's really just like these 4 things are just right here all of the time. Right? And it's almost a little bit irritated because, again, it's, this Dharma I have reached. It's quiet, it's excellent, it's hard to see, it's difficult to awaken to. And then we see what happens is, when we see these tasks or these truths, or really these 4, we think about sometimes clinging and grasping as kind of being these really activated, like really kind of physical movements, but they're not. They're very just subtle, imaginative features in the mind that just simply begins that moment that you've seen probably 1,000 times today. I just want other. I want something else to be happening. I don't want to be like this. I want to be like that. And that's as soon as we start to make that move in our mind, we're out. We're gone. And we'll talk about this tomorrow. Eileen and I were talking about this earlier, this pamphlet written in the 80s by Ajahn Buddhadasa, Nibbana is for everyone. Right? And I just want to read this, if I can find it. And that Nibbana is really where enlightenment comes from. So enlightenment is Nibbana, awakening is Nibbana. And I think what happens if you follow the structure of Buddhism, every time it goes to a new tradition, Nibbana just gets a little bit more elevated, right? To the point where I was watching an interview with Robert Wright. He was interviewing a Tibetan Buddhist master, and he asked him straight up, because Robert Wright's like a scientist, nerdy scientist dude who teaches in New Jersey, right? He wrote that book, Why Buddhism is True. And he said, have you ever reached nirvana? Like just real out of this real like Robert Wrighty, like, you know, have you ever reached nirvana? And the Tibetan master laughed, shrugged and laughed it off as if, oh, what a silly question. Of course I have not reached nirvana. Nobody has. It's so far, so remote. And I think that that's a huge mistake. I think it's right here. Ajahn Buddhadasa says this: when many of you hear the words Nibbana for everyone, you will shake your head and probably won't have any interest in the subject. Nibbana has become a secret that nobody cares about. We have turned it into something barren, secret, and buried away in the scriptures to be paid occasional lip service, even though nobody knows what it means. Without the theme of Nibbana, the Buddha's Dharma would be dead. If nobody is interested in Nibbana, nobody is interested in Buddhism. I feel it is time for us to get interested. So thank you for your kind attention this evening. I offer this for your reflection. Way more exciting than the moon that seeks the arrow. I feel way more excited than I did last night. So let's just sit for a few minutes.